Hello, BookTube. We're going to continue along today with our read-along of Anthony Trollope's great novel, The Prime Minister, the penultimate novel in his Palliser series. And what we're talking about here, really, not just in the chapters that we're reading today, but also in general, is the story of two marriages, really. And two marriages that have fallen on unhappy times. The first of those marriages is Plantagenet Palliser, who is now Prime Minister of England, and his wife, Lady Glencora. Now, their marriage was arranged from the beginning. It was never a love match. Plantagenet Palliser, much earlier in a different Trollope book, flirted briefly with the idea of something approaching a love match for such a cold fish as himself. And, of course, Lady Glencora had to be saved from a disastrous love match by the matchmakers in his family and hers, to a spendthrift named Burgo Fitzgerald. And that's a long time ago. That's water under the bridge. That's many children ago. And their marriage was arranged, and unlike so many other Victorian potboiler romances, they stuck with it. True love was not part of their arrangement. They grew into the fondness and even, I would say, love that they feel for each other by the time we meet them here in early middle age. And Plantagenet Palliser's elevation to the prime ministership has been a nightmare for him. We are told over and over again, including many times in the chapters that we're reading today, how sensitive he is, how thin-skinned he is. The rough and tumble of national politics doesn't appeal to him at all. I mentioned last time that in the pages that we were reading last time, Trollope points out that he's neither capable of glad-handing nor capable of easy communication, and that because of that, he really should be disbarred from ruling over Englishmen. That's pretty damning coming from the narrator of your book, and it gets worse in these chapters, because the little embarrassments that Plantagenet Palliser had to endure in the previous segment that we read, place seekers coming to him and oily guests at his country houses asking him for favors, those are supplanted in these chapters by something real, something that actually could be, for instance, addressed in Parliament openly, and that is certainly fodder for the newspapers. And those incidents revolve around the second unhappy marriage, or at least the man in that marriage. The second unhappy marriage is Emily Wharton, the daughter of a wealthy lawyer named Abel Wharton, who, out of love, starry-eyed, and perhaps without doing her due diligence, married a man named Ferdinand Lopez, who is a financial speculator, and who, although Trollope tells us he married Emily out of love, is an inferior kind of creature. He is motivated by greed. He's motivated by a bit of whining, a bit of self-pity, and it doesn't take long after they're married for his true colors to start to show, even to Emily, who wants nothing more than to believe in him, and eventually even to Emily's father, who asked some stern questions about where Lopez gets his money, what his actual job is, and who in the course of the pages that we're reading now asks much sterner questions about those same subjects. So we have those two marriages that are not going well in the course of this book, and Ferdinand Lopez makes things worse for both, because Burrow opens up. He has taken it into his head that it might do a financial speculator in his position a lot of good to be a member of Parliament. He, of course, as it's made clear in the book, he doesn't really have any idea of serving his country, no patriotism. He's mainly thinking of getting on directorships and boards and whatnot. And a borough has come open. A borough has come available, the borough of Silverbridge, which for ever and ever, for centuries, was in the gift of the Dukes of Omnium. Plantagenet Palliser is the Duke of Omnium. And his uncle and his uncle's forebears from time immemorial would return a member to Parliament from Silverbridge. It was just an accepted thing, that the castle would have a candidate, and that often that candidate would walk over the election without any opponent. A rotten borough, in other words. And reforms have been sweeping the country in the period here, the mid-Victorian period, so that is no longer acceptable, and there's been public outcry against rotten boroughs, and that is all that it takes. That's more than it would have taken anyway for Plantagenet Palliser not to like the idea. So he makes it clear to his wife, who cannot understand why you would throw away a pocket borough, something as easy and innocent as that, why you would throw away that amount of power for the sake of empty righteousness. She can't understand that at all. But he makes it clear to her, and he makes it clear to the newspapers in Silverbridge, that the castle has no candidate, that he has no favorite, that he is not going to notice the election. Even bad enough if he was doing that just as prime minister, or just as the Duke of Omnium, but if he's prime minister too, he wants no connection with any kind of favoritism in any kind of election. He makes it clear to Lady Glen, and she disobeys him. she drops hints in town that Ferdinand Lopez would be a good candidate. And there are power brokers in town who view that as the castle's endorsement of Ferdinand Lopez, and they get behind encouraging him to run for the seat. But wires have been crossed. He has an opponent, first of all, that he hates. And in addition to that, we get the sense that the job of putting him forward as a candidate was a kind of haphazard one and a little bit botched, and we also get this strong impression, Trollope doesn't hammer on it, but if you read between the lines, you get the impression that the people of Silveridge don't like Ferdinand Lopez any more than anyone else does. The more they get a sense for him, the more he sets their teeth on edge. One way or another, he runs up expenses in that election and loses. And because he is a blackguard, because he is an unworthy person, because he is a petty person, he writes a wheedling letter to the Duke, informing him of the expenses, £500, that he has been put to, and strongly hinting that he went to that expense because of the Duchess. And Plantagenet Palliser is furious, goes to his wife, stands over her while she reads the letter, waits in furious silence until she's finished, and then tells her, reads her the riot act, says, my enemies I can overcome, but you, my own wife, a part of me, how am I supposed to deal with that other than simply to pack it up and leave public life? How am I supposed to deal with you interfering like this when I've made it clear to you what I wanted and didn't want? She is upset, of course. She feels like a fool. She also has a heart and does not want to hurt her husband. It makes her a little brusque. When she gets defensive, she acts that way, and she tells him, pay it. Pay the money. It's no good. It means nothing to you. It's no expense on your part. And if it's ever questioned, say that you paid it because of the foolishness of your wife. Put the blame on me. And he tells her, I could never do that, Cora. I could never criticize you, even in private, to an old friend, much less in public. I would never in a million years do that. You mean more to me than anything. It's actually, there's a sweet fraction of a moment where that admission surprises his wife. It shows you that the two marriages that we're talking about here are not equally unhappy, because the marriage between Ferdinand Lopez and Emily Wharton is unsalvageable. To save money, they have moved into Mr. Wharton's house in London. And although he doesn't particularly like Ferdinand Lopez, he's perfectly happy to make do. The house is plenty big enough. He tells them both, if this will help at all, feel free to live here without expense, of course. The meals and the servants are all his. Everything will be provided for them. And for a little while, that eases things. But Ferdinand Lopez can't help being Ferdinand Lopez. And although he has written to the Duke for that £500, and although the Duke immediately decides, yes, pay it. Just pay it and be done with it. Has his agent write a curt note to Ferdinand Lopez with a check for £500. Ferdinand Lopez actually opens that letter at the breakfast table and sees the check and tucks it away in his breast pocket. Although he has done that, he still intends to get the money for that out of Mr. Wharton, to tell Mr. Wharton likewise the same story that he told the Duke, without telling either one. He's double billing, in other words. He's lying to both of them, just for the sake of that extra money. That's all, because he gets the feeling that he can. He gets the feeling that the thing will never become known, and that therefore he will get twice the investment. He cannot resist being a financial swindler, a financial speculator. And there's a moment at the table when he has the Duke's check, where you know, if you didn't know before that the relationship between him and Emily Lopez was doomed, you would know it now. Because if in a couple, married or otherwise, if one member of the couple can no longer stand to even hear the other member of the couple laugh, things are over. And we get that. Trollope writes it really well. He says, the cheery voice was still pleasure to the old man, but the young wife had already come to distrust it. She had learned, though she was hardly conscious of how the lesson had come to her, that a certain tone of cheeriness indicated, if not deceit, at any rate the concealment of something. It grated against her spirit, and when this tone reached her ears, a frown or look of sorrow would cross her brow. And her husband also had perceived that it was so, and knew at such times that he was rebuked. He was hardly aware of what doings, and especially what feelings, were imputed to him as faults, not understanding the lines which separated right from wrong, but he knew when he was condemned by his wife, and he lived in fear that he should also be condemned by his wife's father. That Trollope, when he wants to be, can be really good at sensitive stuff like that. He can be really good at moments like that, that are subtle, that you feel like you're in the room. You feel like you're seeing those little frowns. I like that very much, and there's quite a bit of that in the second half of this book. Other plot lines percolate. In the background, there is Everett Wharton, Emily's brother. In the background, there is Arthur Fletcher, the young man that she was expected by both their families to marry until she married Ferdinand Lopez. But also in the background is a villain that we have seen before in the course of the Palliser novels, a man named Quintus Slide, who is a newspaper editor of the very worst kind. Not that that's saying much, but there's a dinner party. Ferdinand Lopez decides, even though he's living in someone else's house, to throw a dinner party and invite a bunch of people. And of course he invites all the worst people. It's not just Major Pountney, who was the person we saw gravely offend the Duke of Omnium in the last chapters that we read, but also you thought you were rid of her, but no, you're not. Lizzie Eustace, our old friend Lizzie Eustace, who seems always to be making trouble and always living in the demi-monde. She is also at this party, and a whole bunch of stuff is discussed at this party. And Mr. Wharton shows up in the middle of it when he wasn't expected, and it's a horrible, awkward scene. But the main thing that comes of the party is that Lizzie Eustace and a bunch of other people have seen and heard about the check from the Duke of Omnium, and they know about Mr. Wharton. They know that Mr. Wharton does not like his son-in-law. That is amply plain in the course of that meal. And they know about the check from the Duke, and that's enough for Quintus Slide. When he learns about that from Lizzie Eustace, he starts to write about it in the paper. Did the Duke of Omnium pay the election expenses of a hand-picked candidate? I think the people have a right to know if he did. What happened to the idea of no rotten boroughs? Did he do that? Did he try to advance a man of his own? Did he? It's come to the knowledge of this newspaper that there is a check. Ferdinand Lopez's name is attached to that story. He becomes the talk of London. And because he becomes the talk of London, and because the story is brooded around and now suddenly becomes well known, Mr. Wharton knows that he has been defrauded. He's read in the paper that the Duke of Omnium paid those £500 for the election expenses, but he paid them too. And it causes some brutal, frank scenes in Mr. Wharton's home, where he basically has had enough of Ferdinand Lopez and just says, I don't want you to live here, of course. You have defrauded me. You are a criminal and a scoundrel. I don't think I've ever met anyone worse in my life. Ferdinand Lopez retaliates by saying, well, okay, if that's how you think, there's a directorship in a mining company in Guatemala that I'm thinking of taking. And of course I will bring my wife, and you'll never see her again. I will take her to Guatemala, and that'll be the end of it. It leads to some very squalid blackmailing, what amounts to blackmailing. Ferdinand Lopez wants money from Mr. Wharton, and not only to buy shares and whatnot in that mining company, but also just for all the other bills that he hasn't been paying all along this time. And the thing that ruins that plan is that, of course, the mining company agents in London have also already read the stories about the Duke of Omnium. They, too, want nothing to do with Ferdinand Lopez. They give the directorship to someone else. And that leads to a signature climax scene in the chapters that we're reading today. I'm assuming, since this is a read-along, that you've all read those chapters. The ones of you who are following along, probably 4 of you are. So I'm not going to worry about plot revelations in a book that's 150 years old, which is that Ferdinand Lopez decides that everything is hopeless. He decides that his name is blackened. He's been booted out of his club. his name on the financial exchange would be worthless because he's committed fraud in open court. In the open sunlight of the day, he's been revealed. Quintus Slide's aim was at the Duke of Omnium. He didn't care about Ferdinand Lopez one way or another, but the side effect was that Ferdinand Lopez's name is permanently blackened. He decides to kill himself. He decides to go to a railway junction and stand in front of an oncoming train and be blasted to bloody atoms. And that is really the climax of this book. The death of the suicide of Ferdinand Lopez is really the climax of this book. We have another week to read, another quarter of this book. But you can feel it, I think, when you're reading this book. Something vital snaps when that happens. Something goes out of the book when that happens. The remaining chapters after that moment take on a certain air of inevitability. Now, that is true with all Trollope novels. Trollope has often been described as someone who really loves to end his books. He's ending them forever, like for 100 pages. But sometimes he leaves revelations to the end of his books. And there is a small one here. But the main one that I want to talk about is that. And oddly enough, there's also a resolution in the other troubled marriage. The matter is, of course, done with. Quintus Slide can go on writing in the newspaper that maybe the Duke drove this man to suicide. But the real revelation is something, the other revelation, the revelation that has to do with the Duke and Duchess of Omnium, is something I want to read to you because we've seen it before. It's been hinted at. But there's a point here where Lady Glencora makes it very explicit. She goes on at great length and makes you love the character even more than you already did. She says, let's see here. I was so proud when they made him Prime Minister, but I think that I'm beginning to regret it now. Notice that both wives have regretted a big change in their life. Have that on the streets of Victorian London. Both wives have come to regret something that has crept into something they were rejoicing at the beginning of the book. Both of them were. I think I'm beginning to regret it now. Then there was a pause, and the Duchess went on with her newspapers, but she soon resumed her discourse. Her heart was full, and out of a full heart the mouth speaks. They should have made me Prime Minister, and let him be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I begin to see the ways of government now. I could have done all the dirty work. I could have given away garters and ribbons and made my bargains while giving them. I could select sleek, easy bishops who wouldn't be troublesome. I could give pensions and withhold them and make the stupid men peers. I could have the big noblemen at my feet praying to be lieutenants of counties. I could dole out secretaryships and lordships and never one without getting something in return. I could brazen out a job and let the People's Banner, that's Quintus Slide's newspaper, make their worst of it. And I think I could make myself popular with my party and do the high-flowing patriotic talk for the benefit of the provinces. A man at a regular office has to work. That's what Plantagenet is fit for. He wants always to be doing something that shall be really useful, and a man has to toil at that and really know things. But a prime minister should never go beyond generalities about commerce, agriculture, peace, and general philanthropy. Of course, he should have the gift of the gab, and that Plantagenet hasn't got. He never wants to say anything unless he's got something to say. I don't think by that point in the novel, we're 2/3 of the way through, I don't think by this point in the novel anyone who's reading along was going to disagree with a word of that. Lady Glen would have been a great prime minister. She would have been maybe the greatest of all prime ministers. And all the things she thinks there that she would have been able to do, we know she would have been able to do. All the stuff, all the understanding there, the intuitive understanding, it has to be intuitive because keep in mind women aren't allowed to participate in politics at this time in British history. So, all the intuitive understanding there that she shows about the nature of the job of prime minister is effortlessly superior to the understanding that is shown by her husband, who's been a political creature his entire life. It put a smile on my face. It always does, moments like that, because it cannot happen. It's just not possible. But it should be. And there we have it. That is the end of our reading this time along. Those of you who are reading The Prime Minister for the first time, you know already what my first question is going to be. Did you expect what happens to Ferdinand Lopez? Did you expect that his story would end the way it does? If this is your first time reading The Prime Minister, but you've read other Trollope, you maybe might have. Like the garroting that takes place earlier in the book, there is some thematic repetition in here. Trollope has a couple of ideas, of gimmicks that he likes. And he adverts to them. Another one of those gimmicks, some of you may have noticed, you may have been slack-jawed with horror when you did, is a fairly large amount of heartlessness on the part of babies. If you don't want to be a baby in a novel by Anthony Trollope. Emily Wharton is pregnant practically off stage, and the baby lives a day, and the husband doesn't care about it, and in almost no time at all, the wife doesn't care about it. I honestly don't know why that detail is in there, unless it is to give an artificial plot reason why Lopez would hesitate to take up the position in Guatemala because his wife isn't fit for travel. But Trollope has already taken care of that because Lopez doesn't have the money to travel. He's working up his nerve to demand the money of his father-in-law. So I don't actually know. I guess Trollope is just thinking, a happily married couple, once they're done with their honeymoon, will immediately set about the business of procreating. But I don't see this couple as ever having been happy enough to do that. I don't understand that element. Maybe some of you can tell me. I have never understood the poor fate of that baby in these chapters. But I also want to know what you think of everything else. I am assuming, by this point, I assumed this last time, now I'm assuming it even more, that you love Lady Glencora. If you loved her in her triumph, you must love her even more in her defeat. but all the rest of it, I want to hear. I want to hear everything, because we're going to wrap this up next week. And I think I should warn you ahead of time what I hinted at a little bit earlier in this video, which is that you can expect that the rest of this book will be anticlimax. The rest of this book will be what the French call denouement. And it's a falling off of action. It's a slow, systematic resolving of plots. There's one main plot coming in the last quarter of this book. Trollope makes more of it than he should. It's not as interesting as he thinks it is. And I'll be wondering what you think of it. We'll talk all about it next time. But in a very real way, the novel ends with the death of Ferdinand Lopez. At least that's my view. Let me know if you have a different view on the subject. And we'll meet again next week for the last time for the Prime Minister. And keep in mind, those of you who are playing the long game here, that when we're done, we're going to take a weekend off where I talk about myself in an endless Q&A. And then in July, we're going to read the last of the Palliser novels, The Duke's Children. And some of you, about 4 of you, have emailed me and told me the same thing, which is that in order to prepare for that, you downloaded or found a copy of The Duke's Children and began to read it. And I want to stress to you, what I have stressed all along on this channel, long before I was doing a read-along of the Prime Minister. If you are in the middle of reading the Prime Minister and glorying in Lady Glencora Palliser, you really don't want to read the first sentence of The Duke's Children. You really don't. Give it time. Wait until we get there. Don't be so eager. I have described the first sentence of The Duke's Children as one of the saddest lines in English literature, if you've read the other books in the series, and I stand by that. So anyway, we'll get to that. We'll get to that in due time. We'll get to that in 3 weeks. But next week, we move on with the story where our scandal at Silverbridge is largely over, and when Emily Wharton is a widow, draped in black. So we'll reconvene then and see what we make of it. Thank you, Book 2.